again there, guys, I finally got my clutch kit in, along with some more parts for the clutch replacement. So I'm going to show you what kit I got and what other goodies I have here. So let's get right into it. So here we have a Stage 4 clutch kit from the brand called Clutch Max on eBay. Now I know you guys who follow my channel are going to be asking, what happened to the twin disc you're going to be buying? Okay, well, the money for my twin disc is now being spent on a new apartment I found that includes a garage. I'll get into more detail about that later, but this is just for now. This is a budget clutch just to hold the power. This is Stage 4, and it's rated for up to 500 horsepower and 450 torque. So the kit, this is for an E46. Okay, so it converts the dual mass flywheel to a single mass here. This is sourced from Japan, CNC machined, and it's tested at 15,000 RPM to make sure it's balanced. Here we have a 6-puck sprung ceramic clutch disc. They said that the springs are sourced from Germany. I forget where the rest of the clutch is sourced from. I'll have to double check. And then this is their own pressure plate here. Everything seems like it's very good quality. The only thing in here that is not good quality, there's two things. This kit includes a replacement throwout bearing and 2 sizes for pilot bearings because the E36 had 2 different engines and stuff. So I went to FCP Euro and just bought a better quality throwout bearing because this one seems fairly cheap. I don't want to use it. Then also these pilot bearings. This is gonna be my size here. I was inspecting it, and it says made in China. Right there's China, and the brand on it I think was WJB. I know it's not going to focus on it, but I did my research, and there's not much information on these out here besides them being sourced from China. So I do not want to use cheap bearings. So I got new ones overnight shipped from FCP Euro. Also got a new Guibo from them since my other one's too big. And then we also got, a new rear main seal. That'll be going on first before the clutch kit. And then, the new pilot bearing will go in before the clutch. Then I also got a stainless steel pivot pin from Rally Road. This is an upgrade versus the stock one. Since this clutch is going to be a lot more stiffer to actuate, there's going to be more stress on this pin. So instead of going with the usual brass one, I looked them up on some forums. People complained how they wore and how soft they were. So I went even harder and got stainless steel. So this thing should barely wear down, if any. So that's a good upgrade. It's from Rally Road. Awesome website, by the way. So yeah, this clutch should hold fairly well for the time being until I can afford the twin disc once I get moved into my new place. The next clip you'll see is probably me installing the rear main seal. So once I get all changed and over to the garage, I'll get right on it. I'll see you guys soon. Alright, and here is our new rear main seal installed on the engine. So, if you're going to install this rear main seal while it's on the car, I had the housing and everything off, so this gasket back here is new as well. Now, since the engine is mounted kind of sideways, and whenever the oil pan's full of oil, your oil level is going to be like right here, right at this crevice. So, when we have this all apart and everything, you obviously want to make sure that the mating surface is nice and dry for the new gasket maker. It was impossible since the oil was like right here. It kept making everything damp. So I had to drain the oil. I need to do an oil change anyway. Another reason why I drained the oil is because BMW uses thread sealant on their flywheel bolts right here, because the rear part of the crankshaft, as you can see, is hollow. So I imagine if it really wanted to, oil could walk through the threads of the bolts and slowly make its way into the transmission. So BMW uses a bunch of thread sealant. So what I did was I made sure I got these I made sure I got these threads nice and clean and dry for the sealant I'm going to apply. So I had to use a bunch of brake cleaner through every hole. And then I had to take a pick and break some stuff out of there and everything. It took a few minutes. So with a bunch of brake cleaner now in the engine, I wanted to drain the oil. So brake cleaner, evaporates, but still I had quite a bit in there, so I just wanted to drain the oil, make sure. Here we have the single mass flywheel now bolted onto the crankshaft. Okay, so what I did was I put the flywheel up there, Since there's a dowel pin in the crankshaft, there's also going to be a larger hole in the flywheel. Just line it up, stuck it on, and that held it. Then stored a couple bolts by hand after adding my thread locker and stuff, the thread sealant. And then once all the bolts were in, on my lowest setting, on the impact gun, the lowest setting, went around and did some quick zips just to get this flywheel seated. And then since I'm by myself and I needed a way to torque all the bolts, I just got a piece of metal. This just so happens to be a fan clutch removal tool for E46s and Audis. And I bolted it to the flywheel using an old bolt. And then these pegs that hold the pressure plate, I just rested against that. And then used my leg, like that, to anchor it while I was torquing all the bolts. Now, this hurt my leg, so I just got a piece of PVC pipe here and just kind of sleeved it over like this, and then rested that again like that, and that was a lot more comfortable. It worked freaking amazing. So you can see, look at that, I'm moving it with my leg. So your legs are pretty strong. So once that was held by my leg, I put the torque wrench on here and had both my hands free to click, 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 go around and tighten them. Okay, so that was basically it. Now, if you guys install a single mass flywheel or twin disc clutch or whatever, it's very important to contact the company that you bought the clutch kit from and ask them what torque specs to use if the instructions don't specify. So I contacted this company and they just used the stock torque specs. Now, just the stock torque spec for this was 77 foot-pounds. Now, just to be safe, I cranked it up to like 81, 82. Because it is a single mass, it could be a little more harsh. Don't want any bolts backing out. So I decided to use some thread sealant on the first couple of threads. This stuff, and then after those couple threads, I used some high temperature thread locker and high strength thread locker. So this flywheel should be solid now. All right, now it's time to install the clutch disc and pressure plate. I got my pilot bearing installed. This clutch alignment tool that was included in my clutch kit, it was very loose in the pilot bearing, like it was just wobbly. So I tried black tape and everything else, but I couldn't get it to fit properly. So I just put a piece of heat shrink over it, and I worked the bearing back and forth. See how it scrunched this? The bearing should come in about this far now. So this is a lot tighter fit with that heat shrink on there. Now I'm going to install the clutch disc and pressure plate. But before that, you want to clean off the flywheel with some brake cleaner and clean off the contact surface of the pressure plate. What I'm talking about is this contact surface right here. Whenever they ship this stuff, they put a rust inhibitor on it because you do not want any grease or any kind of oil on those mating surfaces. So I get everything cleaned up, and then I'll put the clutch disc in and then the pressure plate. Another thing is to make sure before you put your clutch on is to make sure your clutch disc does indeed fit your splines. That's very important. Before you go ahead and seat your clutch disc, it's always a good idea to double check and see if the company has written on the clutch disc what side to face the flywheel. And thankfully, this company wrote on their flywheel side for me. So on this particular clutch, the protruded end of the disc will go into the flywheel. Some companies don't label their clutch discs, so I've seen on forums people put their clutch disc backwards. And what happens in these cars if you do that, the throw-up bearing guide tube will actually hit the clutch disc if you put it in backwards, so that'll cause binding and everything. So yeah, just always make sure you're putting on your clutch disc in the right direction. I'm going to put this thing in, and I'll be back in a few seconds. And there is our clutch disc installed into the flywheel. Got our tool holding it nice in the center. I'm going to prepare the pressure plate now, clean it, and then put it on. And here is our pressure plate installed onto this clutch. Now, the torque spec they called for was 25, but I added 5 more, so now they're 30 foot-pounds. And I also added some thread locker to these bolts. Usually use blue, but I decided to use red just to be safe. Usually, also, I do not recommend reusing pressure plate bolts, but since these are stainless steel and high-quality bolts, they're just fine to reuse. And always make sure you're tightening in a crisscross pattern to evenly get the pressure plate to clamp down, because you don't want to start here, just like you're tightening a wheel on a car. You want to get even torque. Okay, so currently I am preparing the transmission before it goes back into the car. So working at the back, right now I am installing the new flex disc. So there's going to be 2 things to note. The first thing is going to be what torque spec you use, and then we'll get to that in a moment. The second thing is, if your new flex disc has these little arrows on them, you're going to have to make sure you install it properly. So these little arrows here always point towards the flanges that they're mounting to. So this arrow is pointing to the flange of the transmission. And the next arrow, let me spin this, it'll be pointing back to the flange on the drive shaft. So if the back of this arrow was facing this flange, that is wrong. It is incorrect. So you must make sure your arrows are pointing to the flanges on which it is mounting. And then the torque spec thing, there's actually a wide variation of torque specs for these bolts depending on what bolts you have. Mine so happen to be the this is the size, so M10, M12, M14. The more common ones, at least I believe so, are going to be this torque spec right here, 74 foot-pounds. This is the more common bolt. So just by looking at the bolt, you inspect it, and you'll be able to see the numbers on them. I don't know if you'll be able to read them or not, but these are indeed a 10 point. See the 10.9 on there? On the bottom? It's a 10.9, and is the M12 bolts. So my torque spec is 74 foot-pounds. I'll just leave this up right here, so in case you guys want to screenshot it or whatever for a few seconds, so you guys can see. Alright, so those are all the torque specs for the flex disc. So I'm going to torque this down with my torque wrench, and then I'm going to go to the front and install my throwout bearing and the pivot pin there and all that. Okay, now we're working at the front of the transmission. Just installed our stainless steel pivot pin, and I have some grease on it. And then I did replace the input shaft seal yesterday and reinstalled this guide tube with some thread sealant on each bolt, because that's how it was from the factory. Now you got the also have grease on the guide tube. Lubed up the throwout bearing. It's nice and greased up. And then our clutch fork, both sides are greased. Ideally, you want to use either a Q-tip or a flathead screwdriver to get a nice ball of grease right down that little hole. It's hard spreading with your finger because it just sticks too much, so you want to use some kind of tool or something to actually get it in that hole. So now I'm going to install the clutch fork onto the pivot pin and then put the throwout bearing in. And that's going to be simple as that. We're back now, and the clutch fork and throwout bearing are installed into the transmission. Now, usually you want to install the pin onto the fork with the spring and then put it in, but in this case, the stainless steel pivot pin was a very tight fit in there, so I actually had to take a socket and extension and pound it down because it's supposed to sit flush on that lobe down there. So then I put on the fork over top of it. It was kind of a struggle getting the spring over. So I mean, what you could do is you could probably take a drill and slightly notch out that hole some so it fits in there nice. But this worked out fine. And then just to verify you got a good fit, make sure the spring didn't pop off from underneath. Just take an inspection mirror. See the springs in the groove still of the pivot pin. So that's important so it doesn't fall off. So yeah, it's always better to have the pin on and then put it as one assembly in. But sometimes, I mean, it worked out either way. You also want to put some grease on your splines here. As you can see, my grease is black. So I actually have it inside the splines and a very thin film on the outside. So the clutch disc can slide in there nice and freely. And then also a nice thin coat of grease on the tip of the input shaft, because the bearings are pretty tight tolerances and they fit on there just right. So you want to make sure you have a little bit of grease on there so the transmission slides back onto the engine nice and freely. The transmission is reinstalled. Yeah, I tried using my transmission jack, but it was too big and bulky, so I literally installed this transmission by hand. I just picked it up off my body and slapped it onto the engine, went on nice and smooth for the most part, and then reinstalled the cross member, which I cleaned up a couple days ago. Now the next step after that was to install the selector rod again, and then now I'm going to install the drive shaft. One thing to note is that your drive shaft during removal will sometimes seize on here because the middle portion gets corroded and a little cup sits in there, so it rusts up. So I had to beat it off with a hammer, a couple good hits, and it finally came off. That with a pry bar too. So what I did was I did a quick brush and put some greaser on the outside here. This is actually a mix that I use all the time. There's the bucket out there with the paintbrush hanging out. That is a mixture of ATF and grease. It leaves a really nice consistency, and those two together are a nice rust preventative. So I also brushed off the back of the drive shaft and I also added my mix to it, so it's going to assemble nice and smooth now. And then I'm going to show you the proper torque specs for these bolts, depending on which differential you have and stuff. And I'm going to show you how to properly install the drive shaft and how to properly preload the carrier bearing. Because a lot of guys just throw the drive shaft back on. You're supposed to do what's called preload the bearing, and I'll show you how to do that. And then we'll get these bolts nice and torqued up. So yeah, let's get the drive shaft in. Here is that section of the drive shaft I was talking about. This mounts to the rear differential. It's this cup right here that corrodes and gets stuck in the diff mounting flange. So as you can see, I brushed it off with a wire brush and my lubricant is on it. And now the bolts. Keep in mind my drive shaft is the 4-bolt mounting. So here are the torque specs. In my case, there's one of my bolts right there. I have the standard M10 Torx, so 61 foot-pound. That's my bolt. And there's also a wide variation of bolts and drive shafts for E46 chassis. So here are all the proper torque specs for you. ZNS bolts are bolts that are only made to be one-time torqued. Usually they'll be marked with a blue dot on the head. These aren't those, by the way. I'll just giving you an example. They're called ZN bolts. The S just means silver in this case, so it'd be silver with a blue dot or a yellow dot, one of the two. And there's the other ones. There's mine. These will have a locking head, so I'll replace those two. Then there's these two different colors, same torque spec. So there you guys go for the rear diff. Here we have the drive shaft now mounted to the car. So to install this, you want to go ahead and mount the rear flange first and torque it. I just used my parking brake and I held it just fine. Then rotate it as needed. Then this locking collar should already be loose from disassembly of the drive shaft off of the car. But if it's not, just make sure it's loose right now. And then you're going to go ahead and compress the drive shaft. Compress it so you can mount it to your flex disc. So once it's in line, go ahead and extend it again. So sitting flush on here on your flex disc. And then torque these bolts. Remember, those are 74 foot-pounds on this application. And then the last part is, don't tighten this just yet. Leave it still loose. Now you go ahead and make sure your carrier bearing is up there and not tightened yet, just snugged. Because we have to do what's called preloading. What that involves is sliding the bearing forward 5 millimeters, so roughly 1/4 of an inch. So you're going to grab it, slide it forward, and then tighten it. So as you can see, when it was previously installed, see how the car's dirty and then where it's clean. So it was installed correctly the last time. Somebody actually preloaded it. So right there's where it needs to be. I'm just going to put it back where it was. So you can see that with it just resting normally, it's back there. And then with the preload, it's going to be right there. So same thing on this side. See how it's dirty and then clean? So I'll preload it. So just got to do both sides. Just like that, and then you tighten it. And that's preloading. So once again, install the rear first, torque it. Make sure this is loose. Compress. Extend into the flex disc. Torque. Go back here. Set up your center support. Leave loose. Preload. Torque them. Torque spec is 15 foot-pounds. And then the final step. And then you tighten that. And this is a mere... The torque spec for this is 7.4 foot-pounds. So it's like nothing. Just very... Might even be inch-pounds. Let's go check. I have it written down. I'm pretty sure it's foot-pounds, though. Yeah, there's a center support, 15 foot-pounds. Oh, 89 inch-pounds, which converts to 7.4 foot-pounds. So yeah, that little clamping sleeve is just hand tight. And that is the finished product of the drive shaft. Hey there, guys. Hopefully you guys learned something today from this most recent video. Okay, now back to the apartment situation. Remember how I said I was getting money from my boss from working extra hours? Well, I got that money, and instead of buying my twin disc clutch, which I really wanted, I went ahead and got something more important for myself. I got a new apartment. I just went and signed some paperwork and put money down on it yesterday, and I got the keys in my pocket right now. So I'm probably gonna start moving in there today. Has a garage with it. The reason being why I want a new apartment is because the garage you guys see me working in right now is actually my girlfriend's parents' garage. And what happens is I have summer to work on the car, and then it goes back into storage in the winter. So I feel kind of rushed and kind of anxious all summer long to get things done because they want their garage back in wintertime for their vehicles, which, you know, I would too. Can't be mad at them. But I just get worked up, feel like I'm being rushed and that I'm a burden to them. So I looked, and one day on Facebook I just searched up apartment for rent, and there's a garage with it. Actually, no, I typed in garage for rent, and then the whole apartment came up. I was like, wow. I was like, I can actually afford this. So yeah, I went down and put security deposit and first month's rent down. So I feel blessed. I got a new apartment. There's gonna be no more rush on my car. I can sit there as long as it wants. I'll be living pretty well, relaxed, and yeah. So on the next video, there should be some driving videos coming soon because winter is approaching. I mean, we still got a couple months left, but it's coming. And right now it's fall, so the air temperature outside is getting just about right, just about perfect to keep the car in boost and everything. So I'm going to probably get some driving shots for Vlad tonight because he's very eager to see the car running. I would be too. I would want to see my creation actually. Well, not his creation. I would if I was a tuner, I would want to see the car myself out there with my tunes on it, ripping around. So he's very excited to see my car with his tunes driving. And then I'm gonna take some videos for you guys of the car driving, see how it runs and everything. So yeah, we'll get into that. I'm gonna finish up this clutch video. Like I said, hopefully you guys learned something. If you guys have any tips or tricks for me, maybe you want to hear some more details or something, some add-ins, just let me know. So yeah, until the next video, I'll see you guys later, and have yourselves a good one.